Hello, everyone. I'm Denise Mauserol. I'm a professor in the Woodrow Wilson School in the Center for Policy Research on Energy and Environment, and joint with the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And I'm totally delighted to be able to welcome Governor Whitman to Princeton and to the Woodrow Wilson School today. She just spent an hour in my class, and it was a fantastic discussion we had. During a time of nearly nonstop news on the future of democracy and the threat of climate change, today's speaker brings a storied pedigree in politics and environmental protection to us in a time when there was much less partisanship, I think, than there is at the moment. Christine Todd Whitman was the 50th governor of New Jersey from 1994 to 2000. She was also the first and only female New Jersey governor and the first Republican woman to be re-elected governor in the United States. As governor, she earned praise from Republicans and Democrats for her commitment to preserving a record amount of New Jersey land as permanent green space. She also was recognized by the Natural Resources Defense Council as having instituted the most comprehensive beach monitoring system in the nation. From 2001 to 2003, she was the administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency under President George Bush. As EPA administrator, Governor Whitman promoted common sense environmental improvements, such as watershed-based water protection policies. She championed regulations requiring non-road diesel engines to reduce sulfur emissions by more than 95%, which I think was one of the very significant achievements on environmental protection in the Bush administration. During her tenure, the agency was successful in passing and implementing landmark legislation to promote the redevelopment and reuse of brownfields, which are previously contaminated industrial sites. In 2001, the EPA produced a report detailing the expected effects of global warming in each state in the country. President Bush dismissed the report as the work of the bureaucracy. On June 27, 2003, after having several public conflicts with the Bush administration, Governor Whitman resigned. In an interview in 2007, she stated that Vice President Dick Cheney's insistence on easing air pollution controls led to her resignation. In early 2005, Whitman released a book entitled, "It's My Party Too, Taking Back the Republican Party and Bringing the Country Together Again." She formed a political action committee called It's My Party Too to assist electoral campaigns of moderate Republicans at all levels of government, a species of Republicans which are greatly needed, I think, in today's political environment. Whitman is currently president of the Whitman Strategy Group, a consulting firm specializing in energy and environmental issues that helps leading companies find innovative solutions to environmental challenges. Please join me in welcoming Governor Whitman to the Woodrow Wilson School.
Thank you very much, and let me just say it's always a pleasure to be here. I do have roots with Princeton. I'm not just having lived down the street for a while, but also because my father went here and both my brothers went here. Caused a little bit of family tension because my mother's family was all Yaleys, so we had to deal with that, but we did. There are a lot of things I want to talk about today, but I thought what I'd do is go through some of what I think are going to be the ways we can start to bring things together by institutionalizing some of the norms, some of the things we always considered normal behavior. It was Benjamin Franklin who famously replied when asked what kind of a government we had been given, "A republic if you can keep it." And Woodrow Wilson, who, name might be a bit familiar around here, good old Princeton days, once said, "Democracy is not so much a form of government as a set of principles." So where are we today? Are we beginning to see the failure of our government? Is that what we're looking at? What has happened to the principles on which our government was founded and on which we have relied? I would argue that the values that undergird our American democracy are being tested as never before. Certainly not in my lifetime. I haven't seen anything like this. It's not a failure of the Constitution or of our formal laws, but the bridging of unwritten rules and norms that have governed our actions and those of our elected officials since the beginning. Behaviors which we have considered to be normal over time are being abridged and being challenged today more than ever before. That's why earlier this year, the Brennan Center at NYU Law established a task force on law and the rule of democracy. And I have the honor of co-chairing that with Preet Bharara, and on a task force made up of Republicans and Democrats, people who have served in different positions in government, appointed positions and elective positions. And we have been looking at how do we codify those basic norms that we once considered to be inviolate, things that would never change. But first, our challenge was to explain what these were and why they were important. Why should we care about these norms? These norms, these checks on behavior, has been, as we say, the often invisible guardrails to civic abuse. They have protected law enforcement and the judiciary from undue influence, business people from corruption and favoritism from government, citizens from unfair government actions. In short, they form the very bedrock of our faith in government. And once people start to question that faith, once they start to doubt that those protections are still in place, we're in serious trouble. We have real issues before us. We have faced these sorts of challenges over time. This isn't the first time, this isn't the only time we've seen it. When FDR ran and won first a third time and then a fourth time, upending the tradition set by George Washington of only 2 terms, we passed a constitutional amendment, and we made 2 terms the norm. Nepotism was assumed to be unacceptable and not something that we would ever see in government until JFK appointed his brother as Attorney General, and we saw elected officials starting to seek positions for family members and friends. And then members of Congress acted and passed the anti-nepotism law. During and after President Nixon's time in office, we saw a number of reactions to actions that the president and the administration was taking, including the establishment of the Special Prosecutor's Office, which of course that now has run out, the War Powers Act, and the Budget and Impoundment Control Act. So we have been in places where we have seen what we considered to be normal behavior breached, and we've reacted to it. We have responded to that. But we really have to determine what those norms are all about. It's hard to believe, I mean, many people don't know this, but the term check and balances is nowhere in the Constitution. And yet clearly that is what our founding fathers intended when they established the 3 separate but equal branches of government. There's no question, but they understood the importance of that. And within each of those branches, there are further checks on behavior and the way government works. Courts operate under an accepted rule of conduct. Judiciary has a rule of conduct that they have voluntarily adhered to over the years. It's accepted as norm. That's what happens. The Inspector General and the internal auditors of the various government departments fill that role within each one of the departments. They are there to provide the checks and balances to ensure that we have the kind of a government that we want with the kind of ethical standards that we assume and expect in our elected officials. The unbiased administration of the law is a bedrock of our democracy. Again, it's one of those parts of our democracy that once the public starts to question whether they have access to an independent judiciary and unbiased law, we are in deep trouble. And we've seen that again and again. It was one of the founding principles of our founding fathers, and it was embedded in our Constitution in the 5th and the 14th Amendments, those that dealt with due process and equal protection. Our founding fathers were brilliant at what they were able to anticipate and what they saw as the challenges we were going to face as a government. As citizens, frankly, I believe it is our very real belief and hope that the people we seek to put in elective office are there to do the greater good, are not there just to enhance their own personal lives. That's what we look for when we elect officials. And the emolument clause in the Constitution is the anti-corruption provision within the Constitution designed to ensure that a president should never be in debt to a foreign power. One of those protections that we have had. Freedom of the press has been another assumption on which our country is founded. I mean, Thomas Jefferson, I'm sure we all remember what he was quoted as saying, were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate to prefer the latter. And that is something that we take for granted, something that, again, has been challenged over time. Those of us who have been part of this and continue to be part of this task force believe these norms are critical to the functioning of our democracy and that they are under threat today. But this was not, and this ongoing report is not about this administration. It's about going forward with the assurances that we want to have and we expect to have that our government will function the way we intend it to function and the way we have always assumed other things. In our first report that we released this past October, we took up two of these norms. We took up a focus on ethics in government and the law, the independence of the rule of law and the judiciary. There are more, and we will be taking up more issues over time. But those are the first two, and we offer very specific opportunities for Congress to act to ensure that we have these and that we give Congress a roadmap for actions that they could undertake to institutionalize these reforms. And I want to go through just a few of them with you so that you get an idea of the kinds of things that we can do today that I believe will make us a stronger, safer government. Among the things we ask Congress to do is to pass legislation creating an ethics task force to modernize financial disclosure requirements for government officials, including loopholes on families, businesses, and privately held companies, and streamlining those requirements to ensure that they are not overly burdensome, that you don't get to the point in this complicated world that we live in of business that you're not peeling back the onion to the point where you're asking someone to tell you all about a company that they invested in bought when they invested in another company in which you hold maybe not even a fraction of percentage and you have no idea what they're doing. We have to be careful of that because we have a tendency at times when we institute these kinds of regulations to go overboard and make them so onerous that it's almost impossible to meet with them, and a lot of good people won't go into government. On the other hand, we have an absolute right and an expectation to assume that we know what is critical to know about people who want our support as they seek public office. We also feel that the president and the vice president and anyone who declares for those offices should release their personal and their business tax returns, particularly for the previous 3 years. And that Congress should require a confidential national security financial review for incoming presidents and vice presidents so they don't inadvertently find themselves exposed to undue influence that they might not have considered. We call on Congress to reform the Office of Government Ethics so that it can better enforce the ethical laws with a number of actions we ask them to undertake. One would be granting the Office of Government Ethics the power to, under certain circumstances, conduct confidential investigations of ethics violations in the executive branch. We call on them to create a separate enforcement division within the Office of Government Ethics and allow the office to bring civil enforcement actions in court. Ensure the director of the Office of Government Ethics cannot be removed except for good cause. And ensure that the White House staff, it's made very clear that the White House staff must follow government ethics. It may seem surprising to you, but that is not the case now. There is nothing that requires the staff of the White House to follow the same code of ethics as are required of others in public service. To protect the even-handed administration of justice, we call on Congress to pass legislation requiring the executive branch to articulate clear standards for and report on how they are administering those, how they interact with law enforcement through several actions in order to keep a separation, which, again, this is something that used to be a regular procedure. A limited number of people within the White House were allowed to engage with the Justice Department on ongoing actions. And it excluded those who would have any personal interest in that particular action. And then we asked and we asked that they get the law enforcement agencies to maintain a log of covered White House contacts, those who are allowed to engage with the Justice Department, and that they report that on a regular basis. And they give summary reports to Congress of those actions, those interactions, and those contacts on a regular basis. So we can know who is talking to whom in the Justice Department about a particular case, and what the implications of that interaction could potentially be. To ensure that no one is above the law, we feel that Congress should require written justification from the President for the pardon of any case, any close associates, and should pass a resolution expressly and explicitly condemning self-pardons. Make it very clear that we don't accept self-pardons, and that any pardon that has to do with someone who is directly involved, either business or otherwise, as a contributor, that be justified, that those pardons be justified. Those are just some of the recommendations that we have put before Congress. And we really think that there is a lot that can be done and that needs to be done. This is just recommendations for our first report. And as I said, we will be taking on others as soon as the other members have determined what issues we want to take up. One is, I believe, we will be looking at very shortly, is the use of data. And the public, when the public supports the gathering of data, the research and development that results in data, we ought to be able to see it. We ought to be able to see all of it without any kind of comment, just the data, so that we can know what others are looking at and how they determine the importance of individual issues. I'm often asked, wherever I go, how we got into this place we find ourselves today, where everything is so polarized, where you can't have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you without getting into a fight, where many people were told over Thanksgiving, whatever you do, don't talk about politics. There are many answers to that question, but as I say, I think it basically started with us. Up until this election cycle, when we were looking at voting participation in primaries of 10%, we were leaving it to the most extreme partisans to determine our choices in November. And then we looked at those choices and we said, a pox on both your houses, I don't want to see either of you, and so we didn't vote in the general elections. And again, until this year, average voter turnout in elections where you had the Congress at the top of the ticket was 34%. Again, leaving it to the most partisans to make some of these decisions. And then so many have determined, well, I don't like either party, so I am going to become a registered independent or unaffiliated. That may feel good for a nanosecond, but what that does in so many states is preclude your ability to ever vote in a primary. or we make it difficult. And here in New Jersey, you can declare, but you have to do it 3 months ahead of time. You have to know how you're going to vote and determine and go through the process 3 months ahead of time. We need to remember that while we are very proud and will fight to keep our privileges under our reform of government, we also have some responsibilities. And that doesn't mean just to vote once or twice a year. It means being engaged in between. It means telling our elected representatives what we expect of them and telling them when they're doing what we like what they're doing, as well as telling them when we think what they're doing is wrong. It is our belief on the task force that and believe me, the report is yay thick, and I have just given you a taste of what is in it. We go into much more detail in the report, and you can get it at the Brennan Center, and just look up the task force. We believe that we can do these things, and we need to be supporting those who will take the actions that will result in the kinds of outcomes we expect, even if it is politically uncomfortable for them, because that's what stops so many from doing what they really would like to do. The report I outlined is in the hands of all current and future members of Congress, the incoming classes. We've gotten it out to the media, but now we have to see whether there will be action on it. And that's going to be the next challenge. And we need people to say these kinds of changes are important. It's important that we know and get to see the tax returns, both personal and business, of our elected officials. It's important that we feel comfortable that there'll be a separation and not undue influence from the executive branch of the presidency into the judicial branch. We need to feel that we are getting the information for which we have paid when it's our information. We need these things to feel that our form of government is working the way we've expected it to work. And that is going to take our engagement. It's going to take us being part of it every day. Now, there is good news, and there is hope. There has been an organization that many of you may know of called No Labels. It's been in existence for about 6 or 7 years, and that organization has been dedicated and committed to supporting those candidates who agree to work across party lines to enact policy. Out of that has grown something called the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress, and in the current Congress there are 24 Republicans and 24 Democrat members of that in the House. They have committed to, their commitment is if 75% of them take a position on an issue, they will vote as a bloc. That becomes significant because there's no party that's not going to be able to deal with a bloc, particularly as we grow this. This current session, but not going to see any new things out of them, but they came to an agreement on immigration policy, on security of our borders, and on infrastructure. The problem was they couldn't get them to the floor, and that had to do with the arcane rules that govern the House, particularly. The Senate, it has different rules, but some of them are still just as arcane. So what happened before the election, 19 of the Democrats, particularly afterwards, they were both sides, started to lobby and say that they were not going to vote for a new Speaker of the House unless that person agreed to some changes in the rules governing the House. Since the election, 19 of our Democrat members, have gone to Nancy Pelosi and have been negotiating with her for the last 3 weeks. Last week, she finally agreed to some of the changes. Actually, more changes than I thought she was going to agree to. But of those changes, what she agreed to me, the ones I can understand because the rules of the House are so bizarre that there are a lot of them that I don't get it. But the 3 that really speak to the difference that this can make are, the first one is that it will take a supermajority to pass any piece of legislation in the House. That means you have to be bipartisan. Nobody is going to have a supermajority of just one party. And frankly, any piece of major legislation that we've seen that will stand the test of time has been passed by bipartisan members. When one party alone passes it, when the next party gets in, they do everything they can to undo it. And that's not good for our country. The second thing that was agreed to that I think is easier to understand and important is that if you get 10 members of both parties that want to offer an amendment on a piece of legislation, that it has to be heard and has to be debated and voted on. Today, under the rules, the Hastert rule and others, that doesn't necessarily happen. You can have bipartisan members who want to offer an amendment and they're not allowed to because a piece of legislation comes forward and it's not allowed to have any debate. This would require that. And the third one is guaranteeing to every member the right to introduce a piece of legislation as long as it is consistent with the responsibilities of their committee and they have a bipartisan co-sponsor. Again, it's not something that all members do now and can do now. They don't, all pieces of legislation don't get reported out by the committees. It's the leadership that can determine these things. So just those three, and there are a number of others to which she agreed over time, just those three, I believe, will make a real difference and will make the ability to get some of the recommendations that the task force has put forward enacted. But it'll only happen if the public starts to engage and say, we've had enough. We've had enough of this gridlock. We've had enough of this partisanship. We have problems in this country that need to be solved. We can solve immigration. It's not impossible. We've had a number of pieces of legislation that have gone a long way toward addressing the issue, including ensuring that we have safety in our borders, but also giving a way for people to become citizens that's not so onerous that it takes 15 years. And I just was with somebody from Canada who just got their citizenship 15 years later. We need to solve these problems if we are going to have the strength of a nation, of the nation that we deserve. But it is going to take our involvement and engagement. And I am very hopeful with the kind of turnout we had in this last election cycle, the diversity of the new members who are coming in, and the agreements, because I do believe Nancy Pelosi will be the next Speaker of the House, her agreement to these changes augur well for our ability to do that. But I would also love it, and I'll put a pitch in for this, that as many of you as can or are interested, go to the Brennan Center, look up the task force reports, and look at some of these things that we suggest that Congress enact, and see if they're ones with which you agree. And if you do, get in touch with a member and say, hey, you know, we think this is a good idea. Why don't we have this codified? We didn't need to worry about it always, but, you know, now we know. And again, it's not just this administration. We've seen it happen before, and we've acted before. So these are not wild ideas. In fact, many of them are already in pieces of legislation that have been offered but haven't had debate and haven't moved forward. So if there's anything else that I can leave you with today, it is the importance of our involvement and our participation in government. That's what's going to get it back to a place where we can have reasoned discussions, where we can say, you know, I may not agree with you, but let's work it out. Let's see where we diverge. Let's see what we can do. I'm very hopeful. I'm very hopeful that with the new Congress that we can overcome some of the challenges that we see today. And I'm looking forward to the kind of commitment that this task force has given to the first report as we move on to the next few reports that we get done. With that, I will end, and I would very much like to open it up to questions. And I have been told that the procedure here is that we let the students come first, if students have any questions. But thank you very much. So someone has to be brave. Okay.
Hello.
Yeah, there are 2 microphones, by the way. I forgot to say that.
Hi, my name is Abhiram Karapur. I actually interviewed you 8 years ago, so this is a second appearance for both of us. I had a question. I wanted to, you mentioned that there's been a decline in moderation in both parties. I wonder if you could comment on the fact that maybe some of that has to do with a lot of moderates have come in with a lot of these promises, but moderates generally have a worse track record of meeting some of those promises that they make, and so a lot of people become frustrated and then turn to more conservatives or more liberals in either parties. Could you talk a little bit about how you can, have a moderate candidate who can manage to, uphold some of those promises and not disappoint maybe their base or the electorate at large?
Well, first of all, I challenge a little bit that it's moderates that don't meet their campaign promises. I think there are a lot of people who don't meet their campaign promises, and then we ought to get back at them. We ought to be in their face. We ought to be saying and showing up and saying, look, damn it, you said you were going to do this. I know that when I ran on a promise to reduce income taxes by 30% over 3 years. And I knew that if I didn't do that, I better have a darn good explanation to the public as to why I hadn't accomplished that. That's what I expected. I expected to be held accountable for what I had said I was going to do. And I think that is a standard we ought to apply to every one of our elected officials. If they find something different, and it does happen, I did what I said I was going to do, by the way, in time. But if they find something that changes their opinion, that's okay, as long as they will tell you what it is and will walk you through why they have changed that opinion, what justified that change. And then you can decide whether that makes sense or not. You can decide whether you accept that. And it is something that I don't think is just something for moderates, and I don't think that I have seen more moderates back away. Moderates, these labels are things that drive me nuts anyway, because people would say, are you conservative or liberal? And I'd say, well, you tell me what the issue is, I'll tell you where I am, and then you decide, because it's not going to be the same on every issue. I may seem liberal on one and conservative on another and moderate on a third. But that's up to me. That's my decision-making process. And so I worry when we do start to just categorize people and then make assumptions that, oh, it's like today, you're a Republican? Yeah, I am a Republican. I'm an Eisenhower Republican, which is not reflective in today's policies, I don't feel. And the title of my book would be something different were I to write it today. But I'm still a Republican. And I am going to continue to fight. And that's what I say, and I didn't mention it, but I want to say that idea of being an independent, again, may feel good for that nanosecond. But really what you ought to do is find the party that least offends you, get involved with it, and get it back to where it should be. That's how we make the changes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. My name is Kian Minswu. I'm a postdoc here. So I'm not a student, but I did just graduate this year, so I feel like I'm almost. My question is about the public opinion of this sort of these sort of changes. So the task force, it sounds like there's really good recommendations, and ultimately you want this presumably to feed into public trust in government, right? So my question is, let's suppose that several of these things are enacted. How does the I think it's called task force, how does this committee presume to spread this message so that you can ultimately change sort of public feeling about how the government is performing its duties? Thanks.
Well, I think if the recommendations, it's our feeling, if the recommendations were enacted, that in and of itself would get people a sense of confidence in the government, because they would know now that there are these guardrails that we assumed were always there, but they were unspoken, are now codified. They're now real, and they would be getting more information. And it's when you've got the information, then you can't make an informed decision by definition if you don't have information. And so the more we can ensure that there is information out there, as well as say there are limits on behavior, there are limits on what you can do if you're in public office, and that those are going to be more clearly defined. Because in fairness, there's some squishiness in some of this, because nobody felt the need to really define some of this. And it's easy on the emoluments clause to fudge around the edges. Strengthening that will go a long way to giving people confidence that, no, you can't get around it, This is what it means. This is what it really means. And that, I believe, is the way you get people back and engaged. People become more engaged when they think the process is working and that the government is working for them. Then it's more worth it. Yeah.
Hi, Governor. Thank you for being here. You were actually governor when I was born in the state, so I was actually texting
It happens all the time. It happens all the time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was actually texting my dad. He told me to tell you. He said hi. And so my question is, so we talk about bipartisanship and bringing people from different party lines together to make decisions. But within recent years, I'd say maybe the last 8 years since the 2010 congressional election, we've seen a rise of more right-leaning people, such as the Tea Party or the Freedom Caucus. In response to that, we've seen people rise up on the left, create the Progressive Caucus, and it seems that today, in contrast to, say, 20 years ago, when people actually worked together, now people on both sides of the aisle aren't willing to compromise. And my question is, do you think that we are growing increasingly divisive and divided on political lines, or do we still have time to kind of come together and basically save ourselves?
I think we always have time, and we've got to make it happen. We've got to say that we're tired of this gridlock. We're tired of this hyperpartisanship, and that's why I hold out such hope for the problem solvers. The thing that we have to remember, when the problem solvers, let me back up. We are behaving right now in Congress more like as if we were in a parliamentary system than in our Republican form of government. And that means we're taking every vote as a party line vote, which didn't used to happen. It used to be people were given buys and deals were made, and the two sides, the two leaders would trade off a Democrat here and a Republican there and give their members some freedom to act on what was best for their particular constituents. That's gone by the boards now. And what happens because of Citizens United and because of the ability for the leadership to have these very influential PACs, and then you have these 501c3s that tend to be on the extremes, whether it's MoveOn.org or the Koch brothers. When someone bucks their leadership and says, I'm not going to vote for this position that's supposedly the Republican or the Democrat position because it doesn't make sense or it's not right, they will be challenged in their primaries. And because so much of the country now, the way that the districts have been divided, they're red or they're blue. And so the members in the House, anyway, don't have to worry about the general election. All they have to worry about is the primary. And they're going to win the general election because that's the way the district is set up. And the primaries, the only thing they have to worry about for Republicans is somebody coming in on the right, and for Democrats somebody coming in from the left, so they keep moving in those directions. But that's because those people who are in the center who care about that have not been voting and have not been giving them support by just getting in touch. It makes a huge difference. One example that makes it absolutely clear is after the Sandy Hook shootings, every poll said that between 90 and 95% of the American people wanted some form of restriction on gun control, on guns, whether it was limiting the size of a magazine, background checks at gun shows, or a waiting period to get a gun. Over 90%, well over 90%. Everybody thought, okay, that's what's going to happen because Congress responds to that thing, that sort of pressure. That's what people are telling them. Well, the NRA did what anybody could do, and they mobilized their members. So what Congress was hearing, they were inundated by telephone calls and faxes and letters. We didn't have tweets in the way we do today. And what they were hearing was entirely different. They were hearing 70% or more of their constituents didn't want them to touch anything that had to do with their Second Amendment rights. And I know two senators who, from the same state, one up for re-election, one not, and both of whom would have been inclined to vote for some restrictions. The one up for re-election was hearing better than 70% of her constituents said, don't touch my Second Amendment rights. They determined, as they were up for re-election, that they had to represent the residents of their state, so they voted against any kind of intervention. The other senator followed their conscience and voted for restriction, thinking when they got back to their home state, that they were going to be censured, that they were cooked because it had been so overwhelmingly against, only to find that the polls in their state were the exact opposite. Their state, in fact, overwhelmingly wanted to see some action. But those people had discussions with their television sets and their car radios or their spouses, and not the people who vote. And that's what we've got to remember. It was very clear that the NRA, by engaging their members to put pressure on those people who held the ballots, who were going to do the voting, that they heard from them. And so that's where it comes in, and that's where we have this responsibility. And we can get back to it by saying, this is what we expect of you. And we can support those members who are willing to stand up that way.
All right, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, Alexander Packman. I'm a first-year graduate student. Thanks for your talk. I'd like to get your thoughts on the current government and realistically where you think there's the most room for cooperation. So in other words, if you were advising President Trump or the congressional leadership on where they should be setting the political agenda, which policy issues would you bring to the fore? Where do you think realistically there is room for cooperation with this government?
I wouldn't try to advise President Trump. I don't think it would work. So I just give that one a bye. But seriously, there are a number of areas. As I say, the Problem Solvers Caucus came to an agreement, Republicans and Democrats, better than 75%. And I don't know that it wasn't 100. I just don't know that fact. On immigration, on border security, and on infrastructure. If you want to back it away and say, okay, what would be the easiest of those? Infrastructure, clearly. I mean, I came back up from Washington this morning on Amtrak. Every time I do it, it drives me berserk that we have the kind of infrastructure that we have in this country. It's an embarrassment for a country like ours. I mean, it just shouldn't be. And I could barely type on the thing. Reading, you can't get car sick because you'll get car sick if you read, and you certainly can't handwrite. And that's just inexcusable. So that's the first one. Every constituency has infrastructure issues. So it means that members can take action that will help them back home. Immigration is solvable. President Bush, 43, sent up an immigration bill to the Congress. And it didn't give amnesty. It had a path forward, and it recognized that we're not going to find 11 or 12 million illegal immigrants. We're not going to find them. And if we find them, we're not going to we have a problem now with just the ones we're stopping at the border is where we put people. Where are you going to put them? Who's going to take them back? I mean, we ought to understand that there are certain things that we're going to have to deal with as fact and figure out a way to make people productive citizens of this country, if that's what they come here to do. It's not saying anybody who's committed a major crime, that's different. But we can solve these problems. We just need to start putting that pressure on that the time is now. We have waited too long. Yes, that's a difficult one, but not an insoluble one, because, as I say, the problem solvers did come to an agreement on it. So none of these things, when you start, the real thing that we have to start doing with one another is listening. And I was speaking to one class earlier, or a group earlier. We have to acknowledge that because somebody disagrees with us doesn't make them stupid. It doesn't make them wrong necessarily. We need to understand, why do they think the way they do? Why are they saying what they're saying to me that I disagree with? What is behind that? And can I explain to them what's behind why I think the way I do? And then can we figure out where we have that overlap? Because almost inevitably we will. We basically want the same things in life overall. We want a sense of security. We want to be able to support our families, have a roof over our head, and 3 square meals a day, a job that allows us to do that. We want to feel safe and secure in our homes. These are things we want, and we can work toward those. So I don't think any issue, frankly, is outside the possibility of coming to agreement. It's just that we, the public, have to start saying it's time. It's the way the Environmental Protection Agency was established. In 1970, you're too young, but you might have read it in your history, ancient history books. We had campus riots, anti-Vietnam riots. We had race riots in our cities, and they were burning. We had the women's movement. We had a whole lot of things going on in this country. And Congress didn't suddenly decide and wake up one day and say, oh, gee, we have nothing else to do. Let's establish an Environmental Protection Agency. It didn't happen that way. It happened because the public said we're sick and tired of rivers that spontaneously burst into flame, that we're tired of seeing our forests die because of air pollution and being told we can't go outside in the summer because of bad air quality. We're tired of watching the land turn into a garbage dump. Rachel Carson wrote The Silent Spring, and all of a sudden the pressure made an administration, a Republican administration, Richard Nixon, work with a Democrat-controlled House and Senate and pass the law establishing the Environmental Protection Agency, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and all the rules that underpin our environmental progress today. When you had Republicans who thought any regulation was terrible, and you had Democrats who thought there could never be enough. So we've had these times where we've been divided, and we've had these times where a lot was going on in this country, and we still were able to come together. That's why I think we can still do it today.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Governor Whitman. I'm a freshman here at Princeton as well, and I'm a reporter for the Daily Princetonian. I have two questions for you. The first is what are your opinions on the performance or the effectiveness and the policy taken by...
I'm sorry, what was it?
The first question is what are your opinions on the EPA currently under acting Administrator Andrew Wheeler and President Trump? And also my second question is that you said earlier that you're hopeful about the new Congress elected after the midterm elections. And I was curious about what you think about the possible difficulties that may come with a gridlock between a Democrat-controlled House and a Republican-controlled Senate. Thank you.
Well, let me start with the latter. I early on said I hoped that the House would flip. I am a Republican. I am partisan. But I'm sorry, I think it's healthier to have some checks and balances. And that happens when you have, it doesn't happen when you as well, not that all Republicans get along or all Democrats get along, but it doesn't happen as well when you have all houses and the executive in the hands of the same party. I had that as governor, and there were many times when I wanted, that I wish one of the other houses was in the hands of the Democrats, and frankly, some of the more controversial things that we got done, I did with the Democrats. So it's not always healthy, I don't think, to have it all in one party. As for what I think about EPA under Wheeler, it really doesn't matter who's there because you don't, as a cabinet member, you don't make policy. It's the president's policy, and he wants to see regulations rolled back, and he'd like to see the EPA go away. The difference between Scott Pruitt and Andrew Wheeler is that Scott Pruitt didn't have any clue as to how the agency really worked, the legal constraints on rolling back regulation, and he'd just say he was doing it to get a headline. And most of the actions that he took, where they've been challenged, they've been overruled. Because he didn't, you can't just, as I said in an earlier class, you can't just get up one day and say, no, I don't think arsenic's a problem anymore. You have to provide a scientific basis for reaching that conclusion that differs from the original one that put the regulation in. Now, you should constantly be reviewing regulations on a regular basis. You should cycle back and see, are they redundant? Have things changed so that you don't need to address this issue anymore, or there are new technologies and better ways to do it? That's legitimate. But just to roll them back, to say you've rolled them back, doesn't make any sense. Andrew Wheeler, on the other hand, knows the legal process that needs to be followed. And so when he starts to roll back, well, everything will be challenged in court. It always is, no matter what you do, no matter what the administration, somebody's going to sue you. He'll be more likely, those regulations will be more likely to be changed. And frankly, most of them are being changed in a way that I think is very detrimental to our long-term health as humans and the health of our environment overall.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Chris. I'm a PhD student here in the Woodrow Wilson School studying environmental policy. I had two questions. The first one about voting reform and the second one about the environment as an issue and its potential to be a bipartisan issue. I'll start with the first one. A lot of the issues that you talked about today, the first thing that comes to mind for me is just encouraging more people to vote and particularly making it easier for more people to vote. So I'm wondering if you could talk about some strategies that you find to hold the most promise for enacting voting reform and removing barriers, making it easier for people to vote. The second question about the environment, I'm curious, it seems to have become a very polarized issue, just generally. I mean, there's many aspects to environmental policy, but it seems like the environment as an issue to support has become very partisan. And I'm wondering if you see the potential for the environment to become a bipartisan issue again, if there are particular areas within environmental policy that you see hold the most promise for bipartisan action.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'll take the second one first, and then hopefully I'll remember the first one second. Yes, I do think there is an opportunity to get bipartisanship agreement on some environmental things. Environment is just like every other issue, frankly. We have become so focused on looking at every issue through a partisan political prism rather than through a policy prism that we just look for anything that will allow us to divide people. And the environment is easy to get upset about because when you promulgate a regulation, you are requiring somebody to either change behavior or spend some money on a problem they may not think exists. And so that's easy to hate and it's easy to grandstand. And if your only thing in life is to get one more vote in your caucus or another percentage on your reelect, that's what you want to do, is you want to get people excited and you want to get them angry. And so you try to feed that beast. On something like climate change today, the public is seeing it. I mean, you just have to look outside. We see it. We have the 500-year floods every other year now. We are about 14 inches, the last I heard, above our average rainfall here in New Jersey this fall. I mean, it's happening, and people see it. They understand it. It's just such a big issue, they think, well, what can I do about it? And you have this constant drumbeat from the current administration that it's not real, it's fake news, and that all 95 scientists who were involved with this latest report were somehow not as smart as our president's gut, but that's something different. But that's confusing to people because, in fact, scientists will disagree over things. They'll disagree around the edges. They won't disagree that something's happening, but the degree to which you blame it on, say, human activity and therefore how much you do to correct it, you can find different viewpoints. And so that makes it easy. If what you're after is just grandstanding and not problem solving, that's an easy one to do because it seems so remote to people. It doesn't impact their everyday lives in the way that it does, but they don't see it. And so when you're talking about it, and people are talking about it more and more this way, you have to talk about how it relates to them. They're seeing it because they're going back and forth, or whether you turn the heat on or turn the heat off. Do you wear shorts today or do you wear a parka? Because it'll change from one day to the next, and people intuitively understand that. I've spent more time talking about human health impacts and what it means to human health. And I've done this in both groups of students with whom I've spoken today and asked people, and I'll ask you here, how many of you have asthma, have a family member with asthma, or know somebody with asthma? I mean, in general, you can get about 2/3 of a room to say that. Now, we don't know what causes asthma, but we do know what can trigger an attack or exacerbate an attack, and that's particulate matter. That's pollution. That's air pollution. So when you start saying it that way, and people say, oh, I get that. I know somebody that has asthma, or I have asthma, or a family member has asthma, and I know how that restricts their life. If we can do something about it, that's all to the good. And then what we have to do is talk about the fact that for so long we have looked at environmental regulation we've looked at the environment as a zero-sum game. You either have a clean and green environment or a healthy, thriving economy. Between 1985 and 2012, You had the population of this country grew by over 24%. Our energy demands grew by over 35%. We saw our GDP in real dollars almost double, and at the same time we reduced our 6 criteria pollutants, the 6 worst air pollutants, by over 67%. So we have more people using more energy, growing our economy, and still reducing pollution. We can do this without sacrificing economic growth. But again, it's easy to scare people on the environment. And now, what was the first part?
Thank you. The first question was about voting reform.
Oh, yeah, getting voters to the polls. What's been fascinating to me, and it's ironic that you had so many women running for office this year. With a man, whether you approve of President Trump's policies or not, he's a misogynist, and I think that's pretty clear on some of the things he said about women and the way he treats women in the press or otherwise. And that has really gotten women out. And we are seeing more women in this class in Congress than we've ever seen before. And I may be called a sexist, but I think that's good, because women do have a different way of approaching problems. We do have different life experiences, and we have differing priorities. In fact, we need more minorities, we need more women, because the problems today are so large and so intricate that no one group has all the answers. It's just by definition, they don't have and can't have all the answers to give us solutions that will stand the test of time. And I think people have finally realized after 2018 and this election that votes count and voting matters. But we have to keep that pressure up in the interim. And I am hopeful that what we have seen in this last cycle is not going to be something that's just a flash in the pan, that we are going to see more, and in 2020 we'll see the same kind of turnout. And the public saying, this is my opportunity to be heard, this is my opportunity to send a message, and they'll get out and do it. Because when we don't, the message we're sending is either we don't care, or everybody's doing a fine job. And that's something we've got to remember, because I don't think most people feel that way, or feel all that comfortable that way. The suggestions have been, if you had election day on Saturdays, would that bring more people out? It could. There's no harm in trying it. It's so easy to vote now, though. I don't know that that would really make a big difference. A lot of discussion about mail-in ballots and enabling people to do that ahead of time. And that would help cut down on, encourage participation, might cut down on fraud. Fraud is not the kind of problem that it's been made out to be. When you really get behind the numbers and look at what is actual fraud, how much actually has happened, it's not that much. And so it's been made, we have a solution looking for a problem, or some people think they have a solution looking for a problem. We also have to take a good hard look at, unfortunately, there have been efforts of making it difficult for people to access their right to vote. And that is a basic right in this country. And we should be encouraging everybody who can and legally allowed to vote. And we should not make it so impossibly difficult that we are disenfranchising parts of the population. Should we have something that identifies you as a legitimate voter? Yeah, we should. And we can do that. That's not that hard to do. But we don't do it in a way that is targeted at a particular segment of society to say, we don't want your vote. That's not who we are. That's not how we grew. That's not what makes us a strong country. Our diversity makes us strong. And so we need to keep that encouragement going. But again, that is going to take, I think, some changes in what we see in Congress. I would suggest also that maybe they take a regular work week and work from Monday to Friday instead of Tuesday to Thursday. That might improve productivity somehow. And, it's just a thought when they're complaining now that they're not going to get out for Christmas in the way they want to. And you say, well, maybe if you'd worked during the week before, you would be able to get some of this stuff done before. But anyway, no, I do think that we are seeing a change, and I'm very hopeful that it's not just something that's going to happen, that's not going to reoccur.
Thank you.
Okay.
I'd like to welcome anyone in the audience who'd like to ask questions now who's not a student, so feel free to come to the microphone. And actually,
It doesn't mean students can't, or it means everybody, anybody. Yeah.
Hi there, I'm Molly with the Andlinger Center for Energy and the Environment. And you've mentioned a couple times the idea of getting out and communicating with your representatives. So I have a couple questions sort of related to that. Mm-hmm. I find that it's very challenging to communicate with representatives, whether it's because they are busy fundraising or and they're the time that they are in your county, then they are just seeking, big ticket dinners. And also because you can't really communicate with representatives that are outside of your state that might be the most controversial, and maybe your representatives are representing you effectively because it's an all-blue county or something like that. So what do you see as the most effective ways to communicate with your public representatives?
The most effective way of making them think broader? Represent everybody? There is a difference. The House clearly is meant to be more responsive to a smaller group of people. The Senate is supposed to think the big, broad thoughts and handle those things. We still need to ensure that within those congressional districts, to remember our democracy is, yes, the majority gets the majority of positions, but we protect the rights of the minority. And the minority has a right to be heard. It isn't that you just govern for the majority. And so even in those congressional districts that are all blue and all red, what we need to start thinking about is what is the best process to try to ensure that after 2020, after the census in 2020, and they come back to start redistricting, what's going to be the fairest way to get competitive districts? Because competitive districts are going to be our best bet in ensuring that we appeal to the broadest number of voters. That's why one of the reforms that I believe even even in a red district or a blue district that could have a big impact would be open primaries, and not restrict them to say when you go to the polls and then you decide. You get a ballot that's one side's red and the other side's blue, and you can only vote on one side. You can't switch back and forth. You can only vote for one party, or you declare your party at the polls, because then the candidates would have to speak to all of their constituents, not just the Republicans or not just the Democrats. Now it's just about getting their base out, because traditionally they've been the only people that voted. If I get my base out better than you get yours out, I win. So I think besides looking for and remembering that redistricting is up to the individual states, it's our right to do it however we think it should be done, and so that means engaging with our legislative leaders to say, hey, stop making it just Republicans and Democrats in elective office who are making these decisions. How about we take some people from outside the process, maybe Republicans and Democrats, but some other people involved in this who understand it to do it right. We can do that, but I also think that were we to ask for the ability of people to declare on primary day what their party preference would also be a good way of opening the dialogue prior to Election Day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, I was hoping that you could go into some more specifics about how you're planning on enacting some of the reforms that you're recommending in your reports. Are you actively organizing constituencies or partnering with existing groups? Because elected officials respond to the will of their constituents because they're looking to get reelected. So is the center or your task force taking kind of active steps in that direction?
Well, we're not enacting anything, obviously. But the report is very specific. As I say, a lot of the recommendations are based on already existing bipartisan pieces of legislation that have been offered in one house or the other. So they're not all taken out of whole cloth. And they also are very representative of what we have considered to be normal behavior in the past. So these aren't new, these are not new, far overreaching ideas. And so that makes them more palatable to people because they are things that we have always thought this is the way we behave. We don't allow people to work for more than one master. When we elect them, they work for us. So the idea that they could be have significant interests in another country ought to be disclosed, and they ought to know where their problems could come. We should know, it'd been up until this administration really where we assumed that presidential candidates would release their tax returns. They did until this administration, and they didn't. As I said, this is not the only administration that has broken what we've considered to be normal behavior, and we've acted before, so let's do it now. And it's more getting Congress, we've gotten them in the hands of Congress. As I said, Preet and I have done a number of talks and done interviews and things on them. And what we need now is to have public saying to members of Congress, hey, you know, this makes sense. This is something we thought was always going on. I mean, who knew, how many people here knew that White House staff does not have any legal obligation to adhere to the ethics, the code of ethics in government? I mean, I didn't, and it seems amazing to me that there isn't this requirement, but there isn't. So let's do it. Let's do what we expect people, what people have expected was always there. And that's what makes it what I think to be a set of doable recommendations. And we've met with the Democrat caucus in the House. We met with the Problem Solvers caucus. The Republicans haven't agreed to meet with us, but the Democrats have, and the Republicans and Problem Solvers have, and we've gotten pretty universal support for what we've recommended. So we'll see. I mean, there's going to be a lot on their plates when they get back. And I'm hoping they won't spend their entire time trying to impeach the president. I don't think that's a smart way to go. Oversight, yes. There have been some fairly major ethical breaches that we've seen, and those need to be corrected and need to be watched. But let's get about the people's business for a change.
Thank you.
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
What's the scope of your consulting services?
What do I know from what?
Your consulting firm?
I know that there are a lot of businesses. We're in a really nice position being able to turn down somebody that we think isn't serious about trying to improve their environmental profile. So we have clients that have talked about what is the best way to clean up problematic sites, how to best reduce their emissions. We have a couple of clients who have new technologies, and if we think they're real technologies that can be taken to market, we'll help introduce. We don't lobby on Capitol Hill or anything like that, but we will introduce clients if they have a product that's scalable to the kind of people that they need to talk to in the executive branches. And we have one that's a molten salt processor reactor for nuclear energy, to produce nuclear energy.
So the focus is energy related?
Energy and environment overall, yeah.
Sorry I didn't wear my Somerset Hills. But thanks for signing the history.
Oh, that was my pleasure. That was my pleasure. Any other questions? Well, I guess it's about time anyway, but.
No further questions.
One more. Oh, okay.
What is your group doing to publicize these recommendations that you put in the report?
What are we doing to publicize the recommendations in the report? Everything that we can. Put them in the hands of as many of the media as we can, offer the opportunity to speak on them, meeting with members of Congress. Obviously, once this new Congress is sworn in, Preet and I will be back on Capitol Hill and using opportunities to meet with their staff. I mean, if you want to get things done in Congress, you meet with the staff. Don't worry about the Congress people. Go to the staff. And so we'll be meeting with staff. We've been very good. We've gotten a good reception when we have asked to brief them because they want to know. I mean, the members do want to know. It's not that they go down there just to slough off or enrich themselves. They really do want to make a difference, and particularly with this new class. There are a lot of young people there who are there to make a difference. Now, we may not always agree with the difference they want to make, but they want to see something happen. And I think even the leadership, and I was at a meeting that Chuck Schumer was at not too long ago, and he's extremely partisan, I give you that, but I think he's recognized that he wants to leave a legacy, and if you want to leave a legacy, you've got to get something done, and to get something done, you need bipartisan support if it's going to be something that's going to survive. Yes, ma'am.
What's going to happen with the report about climate change? I mean,
Well, fortunately, even though they tried to make it die by coming out on Black Friday, it didn't work. It's been a lot of attention paid to it. And again, if you haven't seen the report or looked at it, one of the brilliant things they do is give you access to plug in where you live and see what the potential impacts from climate change are in your region. Now here, we're fortunate the Regional Plan Association did that back in, I can't remember whether it was this spring or last winter, that had very specific impacts from sea level rise, particularly on New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. And so that again is it's not going to go away. There is a bipartisan group in Congress on climate change, climate believers. There's a Republican group in Congress that are not climate skeptics. They are believers. So there's a nucleus there to start some thought process going on this. But again, if they don't hear from the people they're meant to represent that this matters, they've got a lot of things that people do get in touch with them about and say, we care about this, we want you to act on that. So, there's going to be a general pressure because the rest of the world is moving forward on this issue. The rest of the world gets it. They're putting pressure on, but it really has to come from us. It's our government. They respond to us, and if we tell them, we think this is serious and we think we have to do something about it. And the good news is that if you look at the most recent polls, better than 70% of the American people believe that climate change is occurring, and better than 50% believe that humans, even amongst Republicans, believe that humans are having an impact. Where we start to fall off is how much of an impact and how much we can do to slow things down. We're never going to stop it, but to slow things down.
Well, Governor Workman, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, great. Thank you very much.